Hey guys, it's Evan from Evan K Exotics. It's late January 2025, and I'm sitting out waiting for an appointment. I have a few minutes to kill, so I thought I'd make a little video. This is actually for OG Vorbis. He just put a comment out there asking for some more information about Dumerils Boas, and in particular on how to get them feeding. So, I guess what I will tell you overall is that the reason I don't feature Dumerils Boas more on my channel is just because I have them, but they're not really the focus of my collection, and I only have a couple of them, and so I want to stay within my lane of speaking, but also I'll tell you that they're a really popular animal, and there are some people that work with them very intently, and I tell you to start paying attention to like Ashley Andre and Paul Mitzefelt, people like them. They're working out really well, and they'd be really good subject area experts. Hopefully I could maybe even get one of them on here to talk about them. But anyways, I guess let me just tell you my understanding about Dumerils Boas, an overview of my experience with them, and some tips about getting them feeding, because I think that's the major hurdle that people have with them. So Dumerils Boa is called Acrantophis dumerili. That's their Latin name, and they are a ground boa from Madagascar. They are a different species, but similar species to Acrantophis madagascariensis, which is the Madagascan ground boa. So there's a little distinction there. It's a little bit confusing. So, Madagascariensis, the MGB, Madagascan ground boa, is different than the Dumerils, which is a ground boa from Madagascar. And they're very similar. And in fact, I think that at one point they weren't even separated into different species. And so there are probably even some hybrids rolling around. There are hybrids rolling around. And really the analogy I like to use is that Dumerils boas and MGBs is kind of like boa imperador and BCC. They are so similar. At one time when science in the hobby was less precise, we thought they were the same, but they are distinctly different animals. The Madagascan ground boa, the Madagascariensis, excuse me, is an analog of the true red tail to even more of a degree. They're known to be bigger, a little more nervous, a little harder to establish in captivity, and harder to breed in captivity. I would say that the MGBs are to even a higher level than true red tails. Breeding true red tails is pretty pedestrian now, whereas I think it's still pretty unusual to breed Madagascan ground boas. But Dumerils are very pervasive in the hobby. They're popular. They're a medium-sized Madagascan boa. They are cryptically patterned. They generally have a reticulated type patterning, but they have color hues from like golds and tans to peaches to browns and blacks. And they're very attractive animals, and they have a lot of different variations within the species. There are some really funky looking ones in the US, but I think the only morph that's known and popular is in Europe. It's called a Toliara. I think there were also maybe some hypodumerils that didn't do well or something like that, but that's me like talking about things that I've heard whispers of. But anyways, overall, the general overview of a medium-sized boa, I think average size is somewhere between 5 and 6 feet. Although there are some whoppers out there, there are some quite big ones like 7, 8, 9 feet, and that makes me wonder if it's just genetics or if it's starting to get hybridized into the Madagascan ground boas. They're temperate boas, so I group them more. You know how you hear me talking about Florida weather versus California weather? They're more in that California weather. Their strategy for gathering heat, they go out and they gather their thermal hours during the day, and they can handle a cool drop down at night. They're similar to like an Argentine boa. They're most analogous to keeping a North American colubrid in the summer. So if you think about like a California king snake, during the daytime, during the warm season, you wanted something up in the upper 80s, maybe low 90s. You want it relatively dry, but you want a humid spot. You want fresh water, but overall, it's a relatively dry. That's kind of how you want to be thinking about your Dumerils boas as well. They can take a nighttime drop down. It can get cooler. In fact, in my South American boa room, I just run a heat mat full time, so it's got a hot spot at 88, but it doesn't really raise the ambient temperatures too much. They're much drier. I don't spray them as much. They don't like sitting on wet coconut like a South American boa does. You can really think of them like keeping a bull snake or a king snake during the summertime. Don't brumate them like you would a North American one, or at least I don't do that. But that is just overall, they're a pretty hardy, medium-sized, tractable boa constrictor for people to keep. The one thing that people have to worry about with older established animals is their feeding response in the cage. They're definitely a tap and hook training type animal. But beyond that, just realize that The major issue people have with them is getting babies to feed, and they can be very reluctant feeders. And I've posted a bunch of videos online about feeding in general, and I think those things apply to Dumerils boas as well. In fact, actually, the first YouTube video I ever posted online was about getting a Dumerils boa to feed. And so I've had 6, 7, maybe 8 Dumerils boas in my collections, and most of them I've gotten in as non-feeders. They've been given to me as non-feeders, and I've just taken the time to establish them. And it's pretty, the ones that I get, because they're probably not the ones that would be feeding right away, it's a long haul process. And so here's what I will tell you. My philosophy towards feeding is that any feeding begets more feeding. So any thing that you can feed your animal will make it more likely to feed strongly and on a variety of prey. And by that, I mean that if you're like, okay, the golden ticket that most people talk about with Dumerils boas is getting quail. And I'll just tell you that quail can work. They are definitely more attractive than rodents for Dumerils boas, but they are not like you're going to get a quail and boom, it's automatically going to fix your problem. So what you're trying to do is be very persistent with offering them feeds at intervals with different types of feed. Give them small mice. I actually then give them a medium mouse. Then you're offering a large mouse. Sometimes I find with Dumerils boas, larger than you'd think prey actually works better than smaller than you'd think prey. Then go into quail. Continue offering them. There's different presentation strategies that you can do. One of the things that I find is that Dumerils boas, will do this thing where and it takes some experience to understand and see this in the flesh with animals, but a snake that is not showing a recoiling, they're not moving away from the prey, is at least not threatened by the prey. You need to be starting to pick up on when that Dumerils boa is not having an adverse reaction to you presenting the prey, and you need to stick with it. When you have very soft feeding Dumerils, if they are at all smelling the prey, if they're at all investigating the prey, if they're at all not just running and hiding under something, you can't, it is the time to be sticking with it with tease feeding, okay, if that makes sense. All right. The next thing I'm going to talk to you is actually a concept that I think John Barry first talked about, and he said this in kind of a fit of frustration as somebody who has a lot of experience, and I think that it made me really change the way I think about approaching problem feeders. And so on Facebook groups, what you will see a lot of the time, especially with Dumerils boas, when somebody comes in and says that they are having trouble getting the feed, the people will say, you need to stuff their cage with substrate, with cover, with litter, make them feel comfortable, make them feel completely stress-free so that they are comfortable to come out and eat, and then they will feed. And John Barry came out and he said that the way he gets more Dumerils boas than most people who ever will produce started on feeding is with a very limited amount of substrate in a very confined space, so that that animal has no option other than to sit and can confront the feeder. The idea is if you have a tub stuffed full of paper and coconut substrate or aspen, it's very easy for that animal to move away from the feeder. It's very easy for it to just go to the other side and say, well, it's not here. Whereas if you have an animal in a very small confined tub with hardly any substrate in it, all it's going to do all night is sit and stare at that crawler mouse or whatever you're offering it, and it's much more likely to eat. So that's the concept that I'm going to talk to you about, is getting it to confront the feeder. So if you, those are basically the two different ways you can try to get your Dumerils boa or any snake to try to feed, is to work with a variety of feeders and a variety of presentation techniques, or work on trying to get it to confront the feeder and leave it in confrontation with that feeder long enough that it will eat it. So along those lines, other things besides just the basic cage setup. So John Barry's talking about a very minimalist and very relatively small container or cage for unestablished Dumerils boa. Another way that might attend to that is cupping or bagging the animal. So if you sit there and you put the feeder in a brown paper bag and staple it up and then put it back inside the cage to keep it warm overnight, it's much more likely to feed in that brown paper bag because it's confined than in its big tubs. Things like that. A deli cup with air holes, the same idea. Always leave them inside the cage to keep them warm and prevent them from escaping. But those types of concepts will get you going. So that's an idea that I will tell you about with Dumerils boas. Another concept I will tell you with Dumerils Boas is there's some school of thought that when they're born, they don't really start feeding until the next spring. So it's January right now, and it's pretty common for people right now to start having the questions like, I got my Dumerils Boa in the fall at a reptile expo, and now it's not feeding, or it fed once or twice and now it's off feeds. And what I will tell you is that I don't think that's 100% normal. I think it's a sign that you have a soft feeding Dumerils Boa. However, I think that just that species, a lot of the individuals will not have had enough feed cycles from once they're born in the summer or fall to once they're sold in the summer or the fall to be really established on feeding, and a lot of them will go into dormancy. There's an idea that this is part of their natural life cycle, and that there's a food scarcity season in the winter, and so that they will persist over the winter without feeding, and then that naturally, as the day lengths get longer, as they get warmer, they have a natural their feeding response naturally increases. So that's a concept too. And if you're in January dealing with something you got in the beginning of or in the summer and the fall, you might be running against this. And I will tell you that you're walking back out of the coldest seasons in January. And so a lot of people who are starting to despair this time of year find hope and success as it turns into spring. And I'll just tell you, that's kind of been my experience with about half the animals that I've been putzing with. I think that about half the animals, I think I told you I've had 7. I think that's the total I have had. Total is 7. I have 3 right now. But I just want to, I want to say just, I think, I'm not looking at my notes, but I think overall about half of them were real picky or real soft. I had really struggled with them. And then sometime in April, May, they pick up. And so that's something hopeful for you guys that I will tell you. But the other thing I will tell you is if you're getting concerned, here's what I will tell you to do to just help your own anxiety. Get a gram scale and weigh your snake. I'm not a big advocate of weighing snakes in general, but get a gram scale, weigh your snake, and then track its weight loss over a month or 2. I think that will help allay any concerns you have, just because they tend to be more metabolically efficient than you would really imagine. That just tends to be what they are, and I find that they don't lose a lot of weight over that time period. So in general, I will tell you that any feeding begets more feeding. Try a variety of prey. Try small mice, medium mice, large mice. Try something that's smaller than you think they'd like. Try something that's bigger than they'd like. Get frozen quail. If you could get a live quail, that's probably the cat's ass. But also don't expect that to be like Willy Wonka's golden ticket. I've had struggles with things that won't eat, like have a ripping feeding response on a quail. It's not a golden ticket all the time. But really just work with it, presenting food on intervals with one of the 2 strategies. Tease feeding something that doesn't show a defensive response, or confining it, confronting it, and just really stick through it and pick at it. It can take, when I've gotten these non-feeders that were probably hadn't fed for 3 or 4 months, it can take me a solid year before I move them on to somebody else because I feel that they're comfortable feeding. So that's just the truth about that species, and that's something that I will tell you is, there you go. I have a lot of information that's on getting snakes to feed. The first YouTube I video is probably 7-8 years old now. It's actually about a Dumerils Boa, one that I got, and it talks about exactly how I set it up and got it feeding. I also have one called Converting Your Snakes to Frozen Thawed, and that discusses a lot of techniques. They're all the same to me. The reason that I can get any snake to feed is because these are generalized techniques that work on most snakes. So I can't tell you that one technique will work, but I can tell you that one of those techniques will almost surely work if you're patient with it. So there's my tip to you. If you have any other questions, are probably outside my expertise with Dumerils Boas, but that's just what I'm going to lay out there for you, and I hope that helps you, make you feel better about your situation. Take care. Bye-bye.